Before I introduce our moderator, let me thank those individuals who brought us this special event tonight. First, a huge thank you to Dara Patel, a sophomore in our Leadership Development Honors Program. All the plans, all the logistics for tonight's event were organized by Dara. In fact, my only responsibility tonight was to be here and to do what Dara told me to do. So hopefully I can do that. Let me also thank Stephanie Hauga, who made the connections to bring these terrific panelists to us tonight. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And of course, we're all very grateful to our panelists and our moderator, who took time out of their very busy schedules to come and share their experience and their insights with us tonight. And then finally, a special thanks to Mike Royer for all that he's done to guide and support this event. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel moderator, Mr. Louis LaTorre, who is uniquely qualified to lead this discussion. Mr. LaTorre is an international lawyer with extensive legal compliance and transactional experience in the life sciences and telecommunications industries. Mr. LaTorre's work is focused on structuring international transactions and managing a wide variety of regulatory, transactional, and compliance matters. He is an expert in the legal aspects of distribution arrangements, trademark licensing, promotion and marketing activities, product registration and recalls, corporate governance, pricing, tax, and customs matters, just to name a few areas. While at Bristol Myers Squibb, Mr. LaTorre led the legal function in a regional project to implement a new business model for the company's pharmaceutical division. He also handled all corporate, regulatory, and employment matters in Latin America and the Caribbean in connection with the divestitures of Medical Imaging and Convatec, as well as the spin-off and IPO of Mead Johnson Nutrition. Prior to his tenure with Bristol Myers Squibb, he served as legal counsel to companies and law firms with an international scope, both in the United States and Peru. Please help me give a warm, still peaceful welcome to Mr. Louis LaTorre.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for those kind words, introduction. I'm very happy to be here and share this event with this fantastic panel. So let's start by introducing the panelists. I have Frank Diana. Frank has 27 years of organizational leadership experience in technology and general management. He is currently leading the digital for TCS Global Consulting. Prior to joining TCS, Mr. Diana led the Business Analytic Growth Initiative for Adherent Corp and managed development of a social computing and advanced analytics platform at Alira Corporation, where he served as Chief Product Officer. Mr. Diana also served as CEO of Traxion, a software startup focused on the business-to-business enablement of small and mid-sized businesses, and as Chief Technology Officer of Fujitsu Consulting, focused on software as a service, web services strategies, open source technologies, e-procurement, and business-to-business communities. Mr. Diana began his career at AT&T in various senior roles, including Chief Information Officer of the company, International Financial Operation. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science and Language. Welcome. To my immediate right, my colleague, friend Luis Diaz. Luis Diaz has over 20 years of extensive experience in a wide range of complex matters, including intellectual property law, technology, related joint ventures and strategic alliances, mergers and acquisitions, sales and marketing, and government relations. Mr. Diaz currently holds the position of Director and Chief Diversity Officer at Gibbons DC, where he focuses his practice on technology, e-commerce, privacy and data security, cloud computer transactions, software licensing and commercialization. He regularly advises clients on a wide range of matters, including privacy and data security compliance, responding to data security breach incidents, preparing written privacy and data security policies, software issues, financial privacy, social networking, and payment card data security. Mr. Diaz represents foreign corporations from Spain, Central America, and South America in the United States. And prior to joining Vivens, Mr. Diaz was Executive Vice President and Senior Counsel with IDT Corporation. He founded the Intellectual Property Group at IDT and managed and oversaw a staff of 600 professionals with a wide range of matters worldwide, including without limitation, software and technology licensing, patent litigation, patent procurement and portfolio development strategies, trademark prosecution, and technology-related mergers and acquisitions, especially in telecommunications-related fields. Mr. Diaz also bachelor's sciences, economics, computer science from Rutgers University, and a juris doctorate from Rutgers University School of Law in New York. Welcome. Let's present Tom Chamber. Tom is Senior Vice President and Global Managing Director for Strategic Account Development at Resources Global Connections, where he leads the company's comprehensive global strategy to develop and expand business with high-profile multinational companies across 85 offices worldwide. Over the past 5 years, Tom has played a critical role in the development of Resources international business, working extensively to help build Resources global network to serve clients in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Tom co-founded Resources New York office back in June 1998 as managing director. Since then, Tom has held a variety of senior leadership positions at Resources. Prior to his tenure with Resources Global Connections, Tom worked at the McManus Group, where he was Vice President, Director of Corporate Finance, with responsibility for worldwide accounting and financial reporting. Previous to that, Tom was a senior manager with Deloitte in Parsippany, New Jersey, serving a variety of multinational companies. Tom holds an MBA in accounting from Rutgers University and a BA in English from Davidson College. Welcome, Tom. We have Faith Taylor. Faith currently oversees Wyndham worldwide sustainability program across all divisions, which includes 25,000 employees and 6,000 sites. She has overseen the development of the company's corporate policy, strategies, and key initiatives, and Wyndham's Green Council since 2007. She is Vice Chair of the American Hotel and Lodging Association's Environmental and Engineering Committee in Washington, D.C., and a member of the World Travel and Tourism Council and International Tourism Partnership Organizations, as well as on the Board of Directors for Sustainable Travel International. As Vice President of Innovation and Product Development for Wyndham, such as Gansberg and Michael Grace and Associates, to co-develop new programs, hotel designs, and in-room product initiatives for the Wyndham Hotel and Resorts brand. She also led the development and launch of Wyndham's worldwide Bloom Harmony, a turnkey spa and fitness program that incorporates a green strategy to promote environmental awareness. She joined the company in January 2003 as Senior Director of Marketing for the Granada brand, responsible for its strategic planning and repositioning programs, marketing budgets, and advertising and media commitment. Prior to that, Ms. Taylor worked for International Home Foods in Parsippany and Idamar Enterprise, and for Avon Products in New York, where she stayed for 10 years in a variety of global brand, marketing, and management positions, and was a recipient of the Chairman's Award for continued outstanding performance. She led the development of several new profitable businesses that generated millions in annual sales. She began her career with Time Warner in New York as a marketing executive for People's Sports Illustrated magazines. Ms. Taylor was named one of the top African American executives in the lodging industry by Black Meetings and Tourism magazine in 2008. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, and her Master's degree in Business Administration from the Wharton School of Business. She's based in Wyndham, worldwide Parsippany, New Jersey office. Welcome. Thank you. Okay, well, the objective of our panel today is to bring together this experienced global business professionals and try to help all of the students present the depth of the global business market and how they can best shape their career and skills to be able to compete internationally. We intend to focus on the challenges and opportunities for job growth in the current job market and provide recommendations on concrete steps to guide the students' current career and educational decisions. To start our discussion, I would ask each of the panelists, and we'll start with Frank, to briefly explain how is affected by or affects global business competition.
Okay. So first, hello everybody. Can you hear me? Great to be here. I recognize a bunch of faces at me. So as mentioned, I work for Tata, which is a global conglomerate with about $100 billion. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of them. Many people don't know who they are. But if you look them up, they make cars, they make teeth, they own a telecommunication company and actually have the biggest telecommunication company in the world. So an example of an Indian-based company that is starting to own spaces and industries within the world. So in terms of global competition, a great example of a foreign company that is starting to make some great progress in terms of owning industry. Part of my job is to sit with executives and understand their business challenges, their priorities. And I can tell you, across the board, there isn't an industry or a company that isn't being disrupted in some way or is fearful of their position within their value chain. So across the board, lots of discussions about not just the job market, but about the future role of the company, their future position within their value chain. So very disruptive in nature. It's a great conversation. But I'd say the answer to the question is, being part of a global business, an Indian-based business, I get to see that firsthand. We're one of the first offshore outsourcing companies that existed back in 1980. So many of the offshoring of work that happened back then was offshore to Tata, and then after that, a number of companies have followed suit.
Thank you. Rich?
Well, I want to answer the question in two parts. I do wear two hats at Gibbons. One is that of an intellectual property lawyer, and in that capacity, the global economy has dramatically impacted where the business comes from to firms like Gibbons. It used to be that most patents were filed in the United States to the tune of 80%, sometimes 90% some years. More and more patent filings are coming from overseas. Part of that is that manufacturing has been sent overseas. So with the manufacturing come the problems, and with the problems come the solutions, and with the solutions come the inventions to get around the solutions. So one of the mega trends that we're seeing in my business is that increasingly many of the patents that are now being filed on many of the future inventions are coming from India, China, and other places like that, and they follow the United States because we're one of the more lucrative markets for patent enforcement. We have very unique laws. They follow in the United Kingdom and Canada and places like that. So global competition impacts the protection side of my business. It also impacts the licensing side of the business. When technologies get licensed for use by American companies, they usually turn to a law firm like Gibbons to prepare those agreements. So we are in the middle of a lot of agreements involving offshore companies that are doing business with U.S. companies, both at a small level and also at the Fortune 500 level, consulting agreements, marketing agreements, and so on. The second hat that I wear is that of a diversity officer. That position did not exist even 7 years ago within the United country. It's a result of the changing demographics of America, which are driven by immigration patterns and things of that nature. So, the U.S. is a microcosm, if you think about it, for what the world has become, which is a very diverse place. And so, as a chief diversity officer, our goal is to ensure that our attorneys have equal cultural competence, that they're able to represent and work with people from all different backgrounds, from all different countries, from all different languages effectively. So we routinely represent companies, from overseas, and when you do that, having language skills matters. Having cultural competence and the ability to deal with people on their terms and based on the way that they interact with others, knowledge of that is very helpful. So that's another way that my business interacts with global companies.
Thank you, Chris. Tom?
Hi everyone, it's good to be here tonight. I'm really happy we're not competing with an NCAA game. And my company, Resources Global, many of you probably don't know. But we spun out of Deloitte & Touche, which is a firm many of you do know in the accounting world. And we were set up and spun out of Deloitte We were set up and spun out of Deloitte in 1999, and we set up a global professional services firm that helps companies execute internal projects and initiatives. So today, many years later, we work with the majority of the Fortune 500. But when we left Deloitte, we were simply about 25 domestic U.S. offices, and one of the things we had to do was set up a global footprint. My role today is to work with most of our large clients and develop relationships with them across international boundaries and geographies. So, in a way, my job every day is affected by global business competition. And I'll tell you a story. When we went to set up in China, it was round about the time that Arthur Andersen, I was talking to the dean about this earlier over drinks, that Andersen had collapsed. And so when we went into China, I was introduced to a number of guys who had been partners at Arthur Andersen who had gone and set up their own shops, set up their own firms, doing what we did. So we thought it was a perfect fit until we spent a lot of time developing guanxi, which is the relationship Chinese want when you have business. They have to develop a close relationship with them before you go into a business negotiation. And when we did, we liked these guys. We were just overwhelmed with the valuation that they put on these firms, their own firms. And it was because of the growth. If you know anything about valuing a company, it's based on future earnings, future revenue growth. Their growth was so out of sight in their minds that we couldn't agree on a price, and we ended up setting up our own offices in Beijing and Shanghai. But that was my first taste of, really global competition. The other aspect of it that I deal with every day is what our clients are looking for. And our clients, again, are PepsiCo, Johnson & Johnson, Citigroup, large companies that all of you know well. And what they're always looking for, quite frankly, is a more cost-effective way to solving their business problems. And I'll talk a little bit of that as the night goes on. But essentially, we were seeing it both in trying to set up our offices, our global network worldwide, but also over time, over the last 10 years, what our clients are looking for. And that's, as Frank put it well, it's disruption. They want things cheaper. We'll talk a little bit about that as the night goes on.
Hi everyone, my name is Faith Taylor, as you know, Senior Vice President of Sustainability, and I always say my job did not exist 10 years ago. And particularly in the hospitality industry where we, Wyndham, have 7,000 hotels, and it's like the Ramada, the Days, the Super 8, the Travelodge, the Planet Hollywood, and we also have rental exchanges and timeshare units. And it's about 90,000 locations in over 100 countries. So we have a global footprint. But the mega trends that why my job exists today is that we have limited resources. And what has happened is you probably hear about this, climate change, but it's more of a resource issue with regards to that there's 7 billion people and we're using 1.4 times the amount of resources in the world. So how do you grow in that the markets like China or in Brazil or in Africa with limited resources? And that's where sustainability comes in. It's about delivering benefits to not only the planet, people, but also your bottom line by developing new, and that's where the innovation comes into my title, developing new technologies like solar, wind, cell fuel to replace oil and other types of resources, to use other renewable resources instead of wood, using bamboo, and on, so that you do have a method to sustain your growth and sustain the population on the earth. The other key critical component is technology, and it's affected every one of our businesses today. It's made it so that it's transparent, so that you can go anywhere in the world online and see what's happening. So when we have hotels, whether it's here in the United States or in China or in India or Brazil, people can see what your business is doing and how it impacts them. That means for our industry that it really has accelerated and made things like how you grow, how you develop your business is transparent to consumers, and now it actually affects how you actually interact with the consumer. And today, more than 70% of all bookings for hotels and hospitality is online. And you know for yourself that you can go out and check out yourself what's going on. So my job daily from a competitive standpoint is impacted globally because I work with these markets and they give me feedback in terms of how are we growing sustainability in China? How are we working with Brazil when they've just passed a law around any company that's on that stock exchange has to report their environmental footprint? How do we work in the United Kingdom where they have passed a law where hotels have to pay carbon taxes on their energy usage? And that's just a sampling of what's going on. So in terms of how I interact daily is globally with all of these facilities and people around the world and how it's impacting our business, but most importantly, trying to develop the solutions associated with how we can do it more effectively and grow in those markets. That's just a little bit about what sustainability is and how that's impacted from a global perspective.
Well, I think now we got a pretty good idea of exactly what all these panelists do and how is that their everyday job is being affected by global business competition. Now, the second question that I would like to ask the panel, and I'm not going to point anyone in particular, but who wants to take it first? Who would you say is our current international competition in the job market?
I'll start.
Okay.
It's an interesting question, and it's timely. I just got back from Denver. I moderated a panel discussion, senior executives in the telecommunication industry, and there was a presenter who was talking about the U.S. and how to better position the U.S. telco industry against global competition. In that industry, our counterparts in Europe and Asia are doing much better than the U.S. telco industry. And so she threw up a slide, which I think is very relevant to the question that I'll just share with you. And the title was, Who Would Have Thought? And it continues, one of the leading car companies in the world would be from India, and that would be Tata. That three of the largest companies in the energy sector would be from China and Brazil, and then they list the other companies from those two countries. A Brazilian bank would be the same size as Goldman Sachs. And three of the largest telecom companies would be from China, India, and Mexico. And the message is clear, and that is that globally our competition is stronger than ever and even dominating certain industries. And that our mindset, our mentality in terms of how we compete has to change. And that was the key message that this specific executive was delivering to her own executives within industry. We have to change the way we compete, we have to change the way we think. Some of these companies in other countries are just more nimble, they just think quicker than we do, I think, especially in this industry, telco, it got very complacent, just didn't move and react fast enough. So I'd say it's very telling that we have that kind of dynamic at play, and I see that across industry. You could probably enter any board room in any company, and you hear a lot of the discussions going on. And we're having a conversation here about job creation and job growth. These companies are worrying about survival.
I'd just like to add something to that, and I'm going to take a contrarian position. We are our own competition. We created a lot of those offshore competitors because we bought into the model that less expensive is better over time. And I would argue that certain resources are strategic resources like oil that should, you have to be careful when you start implementing policies that result in a large number of industries or jobs going somewhere else. And I don't want to take a protectionist point of view, but there is a certain amount of thought that I think needs to be given to what are those resources that are strategic in nature. I think intellectual property is one of those resources, where if you give away your intellectual property, sooner or later, you're going to be competing with yourself in the long run. So I do think that some of these trends have been largely enabled by some of the policies that we have adopted over the last 20 to 30 years that have made it easier for companies to make decisions based on price. My argument is that a modern economy, a first-rate economy where environmental protections, for example, are important, where healthcare is important, and things of that nature, has a built-in cost. And that built-in cost of doing business now puts you in a competitive disadvantage when it comes to some countries, like China, for example, where
The environmental laws are simply not there. Where IP protection simply isn't there. We wouldn't file patents in China or in Mexico a couple of years back because it wasn't what the paper was written on. So my argument is that we are creating a whole competition as a society because we're not really thinking through what should and what should not be sent offshore. And just because it's less doesn't mean that it's better long term.
So can I take a contrarian position?
We're going to get into this on purpose.
So the offshore outsourcing argument, I mean, we offshored low-skilled wage and labor initially. And most companies were able to replicate that, so we didn't gain any competitive advantage by doing that. But the bottom line is that we offshore to countries that are entering their industrial age, where we, as a country, and the Western countries that are entering their knowledge or information age. So to me, it's not so much a policy issue as it is how do we as a country now take advantage of this information age and create new industries and create new innovations and create new offerings, not think in terms of going back to the industrial age and try to compete at that level. So I just disagree with the notion that the policy drove this. I mean, we were going to get here eventually. These developing countries were going to develop.
And you know, I'd have to agree with you because when I look at technology, we're already global. And so, you know, there's these platforms now where you can share intellectual property. And certain business models, you know, certain internet companies are basically using, right, free source, trying to get their, you know, technology out there, get it shared globally, and accelerate and develop their brand that way. I think we have to look at, as we develop the intellectual property, I think that it's really those countries that can innovate the most and really move that forward, which the United States has been outstanding at in the past. I think that's where our opportunity is. You know, I was just at a conference where we were talking about solar panels. And you know, the misnomer is that China has taken over the solar panel industry and basically, you know, dropped the cost to the point where it's really wiped out a lot of the companies here in the United States. But when you really look at the development of solar panels, there's certain technologies that are still in the development of that that's primarily located in the United States, certain chip technology, certain things that China cannot do. So when I look at it, I think that we have to look more globally in terms of how we're manufacturing and developing these new technologies or intellectual property and be able to grow together by certain expertise within certain markets. How we get there, I don't think we have the framework yet. I don't think as a world that we have those types of frameworks to work across markets and to develop intellectual property globally. I don't think we have the way to how to do that yet, but I think that's where we need to go.
I'm going to just again go back to your question on who our current international competition is in the job market. Mike, can you cue that music up again? That was good background. Clearly, you know, for me, it's the emerging markets, and let me just tell you, the emerging markets are those countries with social or business activity that are in the process of rapid growth and rapid industrialism. HSBC, the world's local bank, their economists are kind enough to say that by 2050 now, 2/3 of the world's largest economies will be countries that we currently consider as emerging. Okay, just think about that for a second. You all know that China and India, China the second largest economy in the world, India the fourth largest economy in the world, are already there. Everybody reads about them a lot. One step further, the BRIC, China and India are part of the BRIC economy, so if you add Brazil, which is the seventh largest economy in the world, and what's the one I'm missing? Russia, which is the sixth largest economy in the world. These are already in the top 10. But it's the next tier and the third tier that I want to just mention briefly that you need to know about. Okay, so in the second tier, countries like Egypt, these are in alphabetical order, Indonesia, Mexico, the Philippines, Poland, Turkey, South Africa, and South Korea are already coming up, and I can tell you some stories about those. I was in Sydney 2 weeks ago, and I'm watching CNN in the evening, and the government of Indonesia, the investment authority, is running ads, and what they're telling investors is that 50% of the population in Indonesia is under the age of 30. So just think about that for a second. Compare that to the baby boomer generation that holds the vast majority of the jobs in the U.S. and will soon be retiring. That next tier is even more obscure when it comes to business. But Bangladesh, Iran, Nigeria, which is the big oil companies are all over. Palestine states, Colombia, and Vietnam are all emerging as economies that are going to compete with you, and their students are going to compete with you for jobs in 2020, 2030. I was in Vietnam in December, and I can tell you on the ride from the airport to the city of Hanoi, I passed one giant building after another with the world's largest brands, Sony, Mitsubishi. They were all there already. So it's no surprise that the multinationals are investing in the emerging markets. That's your competition. That's our competition. And just one more stat. Hedge fund capital invested in the emerging markets in the first quarter of 2011 alone, $120 billion. It's a lot of money being invested in those companies, in those countries.
But my only point is, I don't disagree with the megatrend. I think that's a reality that we live in. My point is that from a policy perspective, when you are competing on an in-level playing field, on a not-level playing field with laws that put a cost on our country. For example, we have a wage and labor law in New Jersey. A lot of the small businesses that I represent find it very difficult to compete against products and services that are being offered by countries that don't. So there has to be some way, is my point, of figuring out how to kind of level that playing field a little bit better. And in this initial push, I don't think a lot of thought was really given to whether or not some of those things make sense. And one illustration, the last company that I worked for decided to migrate their operations to Puerto Rico because at that moment in time, Puerto Rico was a tax haven. Until Puerto Rico raised the minimum wage by $1. And they left their buildings and they went to another low-cost haven. And then they go to another one after that. So the point is, we're on the slippery slope, which is very much uncharted. And the trend is there. You have to be aware of it. That's why we're trying to educate you on it. How you respond to it is an interesting issue, and that's something we have to think about.
Thank you. I think that your point, the last part of the discussion, takes us directly into the next question. In an increasingly globalized world, how can countries best protect themselves and their workers from global economic and financial downturns and crises? Who wants to take that?
Okay, I'll start.
Okay.
And then my friend here can jump in.
Yes.
So there's one mentality, I guess, that would be protectionism kind of mentality, which would say, and I think we just did this, slap China with some more duties on their exports to try to level the playing field, or at least address what we think is unfair trade practices. And I'm sure we'll see more of that from a policy perspective. But from a truly competitive perspective, I think much of what's happened in the past has been not about competitive differentiation, but about wage arbitrage or reducing cost structures, without a notion of how do I do that and compete more effectively in the marketplace. I think what we need to do as companies, as a country, is to enable more effective competition through innovation and entrepreneurship, effectively enable our small and mid-sized businesses, and I think this gets very political when we start talking this way, but small and mid-sized businesses are the engine of job growth. And so how do you enable innovation in an effective way? Quick short story, when I was in Atlanta as the chief product officer of a company called Alera, we were trying to build a social network and an analytics platform that would bring universities, government agencies within a region or a city, big market companies within those cities and regions. And the notion was that if you could connect all these constituents, you could enable innovation in a faster and better way, and through that, drive prosperity. So I really think universities play a critical role in how you take that effective innovation process within a university into the commercialization process, how you bring local governments to the table and enable them to drive job growth. It's not going to come from the federal government. It's got to come at the city level. I think those things are the effective way to meet that goal.
That's a great point, and I could never answer this question in 2 minutes. But I will say, look, we have a global economy today, and that's not changing. I think we all recognize that, for those reading the papers. And I see the disruption in the requests from our clients. So we all know that years ago, China became the factory of the world. India is doing a heck of a lot of IT work for the world. And now what I'm starting to see is those countries are starting to be challenged. They are developing middle class. These are countries with 1.2, 1.3 billion people. The middle class is only emerging, as to be the size of our country is today, 300 million, right? It's going to continue. In turn, those people are getting used to luxuries that we've taken for granted, like houses and cars and the like, vacations. And what we're seeing now is requests from our clients in a market like Singapore, which is a mature market, where they no longer want to pay the cost of a consultant. And just by way of benchmarking, we pay an average consultant in the U.S. about $125,000, $130,000 a year. That's average. In New York, it might be slightly higher. In India, we pay that same consultant about $30,000 a year. So there's a lot of the wage arbitrage that Frank referred to. And our clients in a market like Singapore want that arbitrage. They don't want to pay Singapore consulting rates. They're saying, well, can't you get us the people from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which is nearby, it's an hour flight, or what about the Philippines? So what's happening is China and India are starting to be displaced, both in manufacturing and services, by countries like I mentioned before, like the Philippines. In North America, a lot of the shared services are being pushed to now Costa Rica and Panama, which you're probably not hearing about, but I can tell you a lot of companies like Citigroup and Procter & Gamble and some advertising agencies, they're doing a lot of their back office work now out of Costa Rica. In Europe, it's in Eastern Europe primarily. In countries like Poland, Warsaw, Romania is getting some. And in, you would be surprised, in Asia, it's going to the Philippines. And soon it will become Vietnam. So the developed countries such as the U.S., companies in the developed countries really have to start to think global. So Frank talks, it's not the U.S. companies that are the big giants, they're already global. But when Frank mentioned small and mid-sized companies, they need to be particularly attentive to what's happening in emerging markets, because that's where they may be selling their products. And it's a very interesting environment. I think the economic crisis of 2008, 2009 really demonstrated to the world that this is a global economy. Everything is linked. And that was further reinforced by the European debt crisis last year. If you know anybody who had money in the stock market, equities, right? Everybody was getting crushed, not because of what was happening in the U.S., but the fears of what was happening in Europe with the European debt crisis. So I think strategies for job creation come down to two things. Frank mentioned one. One is innovation, and the other for me is the corporate tax environment. We're not going to get political here, but just think about that. For countries that have lowering their tax environments, countries that lower their tax environments are going to find companies coming in to set up shop. And I think one of the candidates has proposed, it's a little bit crazy, zero tax on manufacturing. So if you've read about that in the paper, it's one proposal, it's a little bit out there, right? That's one of the ideas to bring manufacturing back into the United States. Apple, which is a client of ours, primarily in China, and I know you all have an Apple product somewhere in your in your surrounding tonight. They have 60,000 employees worldwide. That may not seem like a lot, but Apple's manufacturing arm, Foxconn, Google Foxconn sometime, F-O-X-C-O-N-N, 1.2 million employees in China alone doing the manufacturing, primarily iPads and iPhones.
One of the things I know that's pretty amazing. I do agree with the innovation in terms of being able to mitigate risk and exposure in global markets. What I'm seeing is that one of the solutions in terms of sustainability, we looked at companies, Dow Jones have been tracking companies that have sustainability metrics that they've used in addition to their financial metrics. And those companies, they found that have both, have performed better throughout this financial crisis than those companies that did not have that. So having sustainability metrics in addition to financial metrics, which is around the environment, social, and governance, has actually been a positive to these overall companies' performance. So then when you start to look at that a little deeper, you start to look at business model examples of how some of these companies are doing that. One of the things that we're starting to look at is sourcing more locally, which would help with this global issue. Sourcing, whether it is food in terms of within our hotels, looking at alternative energy sources that are local so that we're not relying on a grid that might be national and might have failures, but more regional, actually helps us in terms of risk, but also in terms of being able to be more sustainable and green within that certain hotel facility. Those types of things are really, in my mind, when we look at what's going on and when you look at job creation going forward, I think we're going to start to see, instead of more massive type of development, you're going to see more regional, local development, which is more accessible and sustainable for countries to manage. And it's a whole new area that, most companies think you got to go big, you got to go global, but I think in terms of developing more local resources will actually be more sustainable as we go into the future.
Give my 3 cents. When I studied economics, one of the things that you first learn in microeconomic theory is the concept of the multiplier effect, and which is what jobs are about. When you create one job, it generates $1 of revenue. That dollar of revenue multiplies throughout the economy so that the multiplier effect can be as high as 7 times. So the equivalent of $7, just the initial dollar being spent in the local economy. You'll find that in the U.S. there are communities that are very successful because they're very good at keeping the dollar circulating within their communities. If you apply that to now on the side of cost savings, which is the argument that we use to migrate jobs sometimes, $1 is $1. There is no multiplier effect because the multiplier effect is happening somewhere else. So bringing this up to a policy level now, what I would argue is that free trade is not fair trade. We have signed free trade agreements with NAFTA is the first one, CAFTA, which I was part of, and a host of other free trade agreements that were supposed to create this level playing field because they were supposed to bring up the environmental standards. They were supposed to impose some level of arbitrage for resolving disputes. They were supposed to have IPRs, intellectual property rights protections that would level the playing field. They didn't. And the bottom line is some of the smaller companies that went into China first time around, a lot of their technology was copied. And a competitor would spring up a couple of miles away and they would end up competing, because their technology was subject to corporate espionage. They weren't playing by the same rules at the point. So if you're going to have fair competition, you have to have a way of enforcing your rules and through some mechanism. I'm not a big fan of tariffs. However, I am a big fan of Reagan. And one of the things that Reagan did with the Japanese was he said, okay, you can manufacture as many cars as you want, but you can only bring in 1 million into the U.S. unless you create manufacturing facilities in the U.S. There's nothing wrong with local content for companies, like my colleague is saying, to have some type of effort to generate some of the business activity within the country where they're basically selling to. So companies like Origin Associates, which is one of our dear friends, they can assemble some of that material, they can distribute some of that material, they can do the last minute finishing components. So there's ways of creating jobs by having good policies that provide more of an ability for the U.S. companies to compete on a more level playing field.
I'd like to call on a point there. I think you've made a great point because I gave you an example of Apple, and the fact that they're using 1.2 million employees to assemble Apple products in China is not lost on the President of the United States, who has openly said to Steve Jobs and other Apple executives, why can't you move some of those jobs back to the United States? And part of it is education. And so if you look at the educational policy of the U.S., which I can't comment on because I really don't know other than what I read in the papers, the fact is that one of the responses that Apple gave is, we can't find 30,000 qualified engineers to work on the lines in the United States. And so we all know the U.S. is suffering from a shortage of math and science majors, but that's one of the reasons those jobs are in China. China can do that, and we can't.
And I think that's getting out to one of the key questions of this night would be, how can the students here stay ahead in today's job market, and be able to compete in this global competition?
The number one quality, that CEOs have identified as the most valuable quality you can have as an individual in a complex society that is becoming more complex every 24 hours is creativity. That is the number one quality that the CEOs in the IBM study identified as absolutely necessary to success. Thinking outside the box, being creative, being innovative. I think that's extremely important. And in that regard, I think that Americans do have a bit of a competitive advantage. I like to think that societies that are more heterogeneous overall do better in terms of their creativity than societies that are homogeneous. And if you look at history, it kind of bears that out. I mean, there's a historical argument that the Japanese are wonderful at taking things and making them a little better. But in terms of generating the things, they're not necessarily the most creative culture as a society of people. So one of the things that we've been is highly creative. Facebook, eBay, Google, IBM, you name it, have come out of, American inventions. Many of the innovations today are coming out of students just like you. So I think that's the number one problem.
When we actually go out and look at hiring, students, and we have interns all the time, one of the things that we look for is I think for you guys, you live and breathe technology. And that's very important because if you look at the baby boomers, we're not living and breathing technology. So we rely, when we actually develop an eco software system, we develop our website, we work with students to help us do that because that is how you live and breathe. But one of the things that we really like is intellectual curiosity, which means your passion for learning, because you have to adapt to change because it's only going to continue and accelerate. And what we're seeing is that those who can adapt, who can stay on top of the changes that are happening, which is for us, is just like how we're living daily, whether there's a financial crisis or there's an environmental crisis or what's the new technology, iPhones didn't exist, now it's iPad. Being able to adapt and change and having the curiosity to stay on top of it is something that we look for in students that we try to hire, because you can't really teach that. It's just something that you do naturally every day and day in and day out. But as you go throughout a corporation or a company, having that capability is really going to help you when you have to adjust to all of these things that are happening.
So, just a couple thoughts. Two of the key things that we advise executives in terms of the traits that they need as a company to succeed in the future are collaboration skills and analytic skills. And the reasons for that are, in the future, most value-added services and products that companies deliver will be the combination of services and products that come together from a series of players within a value chain. It just won't be a vertically structured company anymore. It's going to be really a number of companies coming together. I'll give you an example. Telcos have dominated the communication industry for years, but Facebook and Google are arguably said to be really the real kings of communication today, and they're riding on top of the telecommunication infrastructure. If telcos don't change and start partnering with companies like Facebook and Google, they could very well become dumb pipes, and the value proposition becomes very low. So one of the key things is relationship skills, how to manage relationships, and how to collaborate across a wide variety of partners is critical. Two, there's more data available to companies today than ever imaginable, and that number is going to grow exponentially over the next several years. So there's just no way for companies to effectively make decisions and manage that data volume without, one, technology, and two, analytic skills within their employee base. People that can take an insight from data and make decisions quickly from that insight. So rapid decision making is a critical skill set that employees in job market need.
I agree with what's been said so far, and I'll add just a couple thoughts. So I was in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago when I got the email from Stephanie with some of the questions. And I've talked about the emerging markets tonight quite a bit as something I want you to leave with about the impact of those countries on the business, the global economy. But I went to our managing director who runs Greater China. I walked across the hall to his office and asked him what he thought students should do to stay ahead in today's environment. He's Chinese. He said, well, I believe that companies are going to need employees who understand those emerging markets we talked about. He said those graduates who demonstrate an understanding of the global economy, particularly the emerging markets, will be in demand. And so some thoughts on how to do that. Don't be so U.S.-centric with your studies, okay? Take some courses that are a little outside the box and learn about what's going on around the world, or at least in your career. If you can't do it here at Seton Hall, I'm sure you can. If possible, and this is out there, right, pursue an internship that is somewhere in the world that is an emerging market. That's something to think about, but I know there's opportunities. It may cost you the effort to get there, but if you can pursue something like that, it's really going to add to your resume and make you a valuable potential employee to some company that's looking at sustainability in, Eastern Europe. I can't say enough, and we do this not very well as a country, but fluency in a second language. I can tell you I spent a lot of time in China, and every one of those students is learning English. I can almost tell you that I don't run into too many students here that are stuttering Mandarin. There is someone on my street. He's been, our schools, I live in Suffern, New York, and we have Mandarin in the public schools starting in 5th grade. And I couldn't convince my kids to take it, but one of my neighbor's sons has been taking it since the 5th grade. And I said, he's a smart kid, I said, Jack, no matter what you do, wherever you go to college, he's continued his Mandarin in high school, he's going to continue in college. I said, no matter what you do, stay with the Mandarin, because if you're in banking, if you're in law, if you're in medicine, it doesn't matter. What's going to distinguish you when you apply for anything is if you speak Chinese. And 95% to 99% of your peers do not. So I would really strongly, if you can still do it here for sophomores, take 2 years of Mandarin if it's offered, or some other language if you know will give you the edge. And then last but not least, take some risks in your career. Don't worry about that first job so much. It's not going to be your last job. It might get you in the door and it's going to pay your bills, which I know we all need. But don't be afraid to take some risks. The old story is true. No risk, no reward. Look, I was an English major who couldn't find a job and went into accounting, got a graduate degree across the town at Rutgers, and then now I'm in sales. Essentially, that's what I'm doing, selling our services to companies worldwide. So don't be afraid to take some risks.
And I'm a great example of that, because when our company spun off 5 years ago, I had a chance to talk with our chairman. And anybody here see the movie Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore? And at that time, my son had told me, came home one day and talked to my husband and I and said, hey, Mom, Dad, you have to go see this movie. And I was doing some projects, developing hotel prototypes, and I saw this consumer trend of going green. But when I saw that movie, it really made me realize the impact of what's happening from a resource perspective, and how are we going to keep developing our company as we move forward. So I had the chance to talk with our chairman, and I said, you know what, I know we just spun off, but we have to think about sustainability. We need to do that. So, he comes back to me a month later and says, why don't you start that? No money. But you know what, why don't you go ahead and start that group? And I was like, okay. So I was fortunate that I had a chance to work with all of these different people within the organization on a global project. And so I went to them and I said, I knew some of the people were already doing green things at our company, and I said, we need to start a green council. So that's how we started. And then 5 years later, now it's a resource department. It's 250 council members throughout the world. It's, we won a Newsweek award for being one of the greenest companies in America. But that's taking a risk, right? Because I was like, he could have just looked at me and started laughing and said, you're out of your mind. And he said, why'd you start it? And I did with just an idea with the grassroots organization, but over time now it's part of a strategic imperative. It's a senior leadership is endorsed it. He goes out and speaks about it. We have a strategy around it. So to me, it was like, well, what the heck? I might as well just say something. And it was something that is now strategic later. So when he says take a risk, I say go ahead and do that. You should go for your passion, go for what you love. And if you love it, you'll do well at it. You'll stick through it because it's going to change, it's going to evolve, and things are going to keep happening. So, it truly is, and that's what I tell my kids too. Go for what you love, what you have a passion for. Take that risk. If it doesn't work out, it'll be a great learning experience, and you can go on and use that somewhere else.
I just want to add something to that, if I may, Louis. I think Faith makes a really great point. I was reading yesterday in the USA Today that we're talking about future of driverless automobiles. And it just reinforced the whole concept of creative destruction, that technology will disrupt and destroy entire industries. And you, as the future generation, and I tell this to my daughter and my son, have to stay ahead of the curve. So what does that mean? It means that you have to keep track of those trends that are impacting your lives today, whether it's Facebook or whether it's social media in different forms, or whether it's this push toward green or sustainable technologies. Whatever those trends are that impact your world, you need to know about them. So you can't just, graduate, go into a 4x4 office and think that you're going to be fine doing whatever you started doing. None of us are doing what we started doing.
That's true.
I don't know if that's the same for my colleague, but I believe it's probably true.
So that is a very important point that my colleague made. We should take that away as a huge point.
Now, if you will now open it up for questions from the audience. Yeah, I mean, we have basically covered. And I think, expect that.
Well, on that last point, somebody asked the question, I want to just say this. I just finished the Waterview article with our chairman on success in law, and I think success in other fields is the same. What we found is that success is not so much a function of human capital in law as it is social capital. So, you can go to the best school, get the best grades, go into a field and fail miserably. Not make partner, not make whatever the next level of the rung is. And the reason is because you don't have the soft skills to succeed. Those soft skills involve leadership skills, networking skills, interpersonal skills, communication skills, language skills. Those are the skills, I believe, that ultimately differentiate, competent people working within a set of environments where it's more subjective than objective. Right now, you get grades for your performance. In the real world, we don't get grades. You get a once-a-year review, and it's based on what people thought of you as a collective over the period of time. It's very different. So there's, in a socially constructed model like that, you got to know how to deal with it. So if you learn nothing else, learn to network, learn to communicate. That was reinforced before. Develop some skills where people will want to interact with you. I think leadership is what you're learning from Mike Reuter. That's critically important. That's the reason Faith took the course that she did, and everybody else here has too.
If I had to leave you with one thought, I would say, you're going to be competing for jobs in a very, different world, I think, than many of us here experience. One thing I think you need to try to figure out is how you differentiate yourself on paper when you apply for some of these jobs online. And just remember that whoever's reviewing those resumes or whatever application you're filling out is going to review so many of them that what's going to really stand out in someone's mind when they're looking at a resume or an application is what differentiates you on paper. And so when you're going about your activities and your internships and your studies, courses that might not appeal to you but could be very good to appeal is something you should think about. But the key is, and this is really important, what is going to differentiate you from the next person who's applying for that job who also has good grades, good school, and all those things? That's where I think some of the things we've talked about tonight, you really need to take away and say, how do I differentiate myself going forward so that I can be, making my point and pursuing my dream and getting that job or position someday where I want to be. And again, even if it's not where you want to end up, it's a good starting point. So that's, really what I would leave you with.
And I would say when you differentiate, just be honest, be authentic, be who you are. It's so funny because when I talk to my son, it's not about resume building. It really isn't, because we see so many resumes, you can tell, are you just doing these things because you think it's the right thing, or are you doing it because you truly love that? And when you come in, you can talk about that and how you're passionate about that. So I really say, really just understand and try to be authentic and honest with who you are and what you want to do, and it will come across in your resume and when you go in for that interview. And as you continue through this journey, which is, all of us said we didn't start where we're at today, and we got to a very different place, but just, it's a journey and you need to persevere through it, right? There's, just like anything, there's ups and downs, valleys, but just keep going along and being honest with who you are and what you want to do, and it'll work out in the long run. And, I think a lot of times, I tried different things that I was like, oh no, there's just no way that I'm going to be a computer programmer. That's not me, right? But, I learned that. I did computer programming for a couple of years, and I said, oh, I can't do that. I'm going to go back to business school, and I like marketing. And so, I experimented and tried different jobs, and that's okay, because that's what you learn, what you don't like to do. So I think just be really honest with yourself, go through, as you look at these jobs, and really try to instill that as you go throughout and try these different things and learn from them. And it's okay. It's not the end-all, be-all if you try something and it doesn't work out. You can always go on and try something else.
Yes.
We talked a lot about,
jobs being outsourced and a lot of corporations taking manufacturing jobs to emerging markets. Do you think it's practical for, say, the government in the next 4 years to maybe give corporations tax incentives for keeping jobs in the United States?
Since I raised the issue, I might as well. I personally don't think it's not only a tax issue. I think tax helps, but there have to be more holistic approaches to the issue of outsourcing of jobs. There have to be incentives beyond just tax incentives that are created that make a company want to be in a particular area. I think having an educated workforce, one of my colleagues alluded to that as an issue, is important. That's why Silicon Valley, for example, has done as well as it has with regard to technology, because they've had all these wonderful universities to draw from the area that produce incredibly talented candidates. Same thing in Massachusetts, and I know that here in New Jersey, here in Newark, we have NJIT and we have Rutgers, and this has become a bit of a hub for technology. So it's, to answer the question, is I believe that there's incentives that can be created to want to have companies remain. It's going to take a lot more than just tax incentives for that to happen. Companies also have to generate revenue. There's a lot of contracts that are generated by governmental entities and others that could be used as in a legal way as the honey, if you will, to want to create that incentive to have it made in America. But there's also these bigger issues at the federal government level involving what is fair and what is not. That basic question is a huge issue. I've read some of those massive agreements, and they look good. It sounds fair, but even the people that write them many times don't realize how they practically don't always play out the way we think. And not always to the disadvantage of the U.S., sometimes to the disadvantage of the other markets. And when NAFTA first came out, one of the negative things that it did is it made tortilla prices go up by so much that the average Mexican couldn't afford to eat tortillas. They had to import rice. It's crazy. So people have to think about these things in a more holistic way.
Any other questions? John.
So, as I mentioned before, global job market culture is also very important. So how have you personally dealt with cultural changes while traveling or interacting with other branches outside of the U.S.?
That's a great question. Since we had to set up we were in more countries than we are, but we had to set them up from scratch. And I have a book called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. And it has a chapter on every country in the world, and it gives pretty good practical advice. So I usually have my assistant photocopy that chapter and stick it in my travel binder. But then I'll ask the local, but we have a set up shop, but we don't hire or move anyone from the U.S. to run our offices overseas. It's all locals that we hire who have that similar experience that we look for. And then generally, as I'm working with them, I ask them, how to, particularly some very formal cultures like Japan, where even the presentation of business card is very formal. What you do with it, you don't stick it in your pocket. You just insult it and ruin the whole deal. But if you're working with colleagues in foreign countries, you can ask them for advice, but don't underestimate, that's a great question, the importance of culture in doing international business and how important it is, even in whether you go to dinner, don't go to dinner, whatever you do, everything has meanings. And it's so funny in the book sometimes, or even things you read on the internet, certain gestures that we take for granted here in the U.S., like hailing a taxi like this, can be very offensive in other cultures. So, you really have to, you can't show the soles of your shoes in certain countries. It's offensive. So, great question, but I have to read and sometimes make mistakes.
I think that, as I know, we're in 100 countries, and there's a certain amount of humility when you work with other countries and cultures, and having a certain amount, and humility in the sense of being able to listen and ask the people in that country about the cultural standards and things, how they do things, and being sincere in that, people will actually share with you and help you as you're in those countries. And really, when you show respect to anybody in any country, and you show that compassion and humility, they will help you when they see that sincerity. And so as we, have, the other things that you see that we try to do a lot of assignments overseas, and we take people in our company and put them overseas, and then we bring people from other countries and bring them to our office so that we can have more of that interaction and cultural, so that we can learn from each other. Because that's the only way that you can actually do better in another culture, or they can learn from you, is that you have to put the people together to interact. But I think there's a certain attitude that we try to train around, which is being, humble and trying to listen and compassionate about that culture as you're developing that market, and incorporating that into your program or your services. I was really fortunate when I worked at Avon for 10 years that I was on a global green council, and whenever we launched a product, so you think, okay, so you're launching a lipstick. When we launched it in Spain versus Europe, there were all these different cultural things as well as legal things of how we actually developed that with the sales force. So that was a great experience because it really taught me the difference of, okay, this might be one product, but how it's translated in 6 different countries is very different. And so once you start to learn that, and I think it's a certain attitude that you have to come to the table with, and that helps that in terms of when you develop a market.
That's a great point. I just want to add, people really appreciate the fact that you have an interest in their country or culture. So when you ask questions, it's okay. You're showing interest, they appreciate that, and they'll really teach you.
Just a different perspective, you could find yourselves working for a foreign company. And so, for example, in Tata's case, 230,000 employees, 20,000 of which are here in the U.S. Everybody else is in India. And so from a cultural perspective, you're entering a business that is dominated by a different culture. And so it's just very interesting, the dynamic that we see in that. For example, I was just making this point before the session. As consultants, we talk to the executives all the time and not always tell them what they want to hear, right? Your job is to help them understand things in that city. In the Indian culture, that's not something that they're very comfortable doing, right? They want to please. They want to customer satisfying, and so they resist that notion. I can tell you number of meetings I've gone to where they say, "Don't say that." Well, I must say, I have to say that. That's what I'm paid for, right? So it's just very interesting. If you're in a company whose dominant culture is not your own, there's a lot of adjusting and adapting to do.
I'll just add this observation. As a chief diversity officer, one of the things that we teach is cultural competence. Just because you have to practice that here in the States. I mean, we're going to be a majority of minorities by 2042. You go to New York, you can visit Little Italy, you can visit Chinatown. You will be experiencing culture in a very real way. In a very, talk about the Indian culture in Edison, New Jersey. There are some incredible restaurants that speak pretty much, traditional tongue, anywhere you go. So you don't have to go very far in New Jersey to develop cultural competence, I don't think. Or in New York, we have an advantage. And if you go to Arizona, where I lived for 11 years, you're going to have a hard time developing cultural competence because you don't have that demographic mix that we have. So that could actually be an advantage for you as an Eastern U.S.-based person to take advantage of those opportunities. Another thing that you can use is travel. My daughter, there's something called Semester at Sea at the University of Virginia. I think it's 9 countries, 1 summer, 9 credits or some crazy thing like that. And it wasn't an unreasonable amount of money to get exposure on a very direct basis with these wonderful countries in the Mediterranean. So things like that give you that type of experience will amplify I think your education and differentiate you qualitatively from your peers. So it's not just a resume builder, it's a life builder.
My question is for Mr. Schoenberg. You spoke about how the new emerging markets in Indonesia and Vietnam. In the future, I guess, do you see room for all these different markets, such as India, China, the U.S., as well as emerging markets? Do you think potential market can suffer from others?
That's a great question. I don't really know what kind of zero-sum game it'll be, but I can tell you that those jobs, everyone's looking for the cost efficiencies, and I imagine that certain countries might develop certain specific industry or skill sets like India's done with the IT sector, but it will impact certain, China the graduates in Chinese universities, and I forget what the number is, but they're graduating almost millions of students every year. The vast majority, unless you're going to Peking University in Beijing or some of the top universities, those students are struggling for jobs because the Chinese economy is slowing down. My father went to Xi'an. He's 74 years old and decided to volunteer with some program here to go to teach in Xi'an for about 6 months, and came back and said that this mid-tier university, the students were hoping to get jobs in hotels in the big cities. So I don't know. I think, you know, that you certainly aren't going to see in the short term Vietnam owning any industries or Indonesia, but you know, over time, we're talking by 2050, right? That HSBC stat I gave you, that you'll see innovation, I think, continue in the U.S., you know, hopefully, and maybe some of that innovation start to spread. You already see these micro companies in places like Africa setting up with micro loans and people doing business. Now, I don't know how much of an impact that will have on the global business, but the point is, everybody is striving, and they're seeing the success of entrepreneurial ventures, and the corporations have done what over time? They're downsizing, constantly downsizing. I was at Merck today. So Merck acquires Shearing Plow and has 106,000 total jobs at the time. Well, guess what? That's 2 years ago. They're down to 83,000 jobs worldwide, and their target is 75,000 jobs worldwide. All right, so those jobs at large companies, for the most part, and I know many of you target those companies as potential employers, those jobs are going away. But entrepreneurial jobs, no matter where you are, whether it's Indonesia, China, the U.S., they're going to be there because it's all about innovation and creating the technologies and other services that don't exist today. Facebook did not exist, what, 10 years ago? And now it's a major employer about to become one of the biggest IPOs U.S. business has ever seen.
Yeah, see, I think that's the key point in terms of entrepreneurship, innovation, and creating new markets, creating new industries, as opposed to relishing what we had in the past. But just a counterpoint. The emerging markets may take jobs, but they also represent opportunity for us to sell our goods and services to a market that didn't exist before, right? So, for example, there's a stat that says in some of these emerging companies, more people have mobile phones than bathrooms in their houses. I mean, think about that. And so you've got an unbanked population, you've got a population with no insurance, and now these companies are starting to think about how do I sell banking services to them on their cell phone, or the microloans, or microinsurance, etc. So most companies I talk to see the emerging markets as a wonderful opportunity for revenue creation that didn't exist before. So it goes both ways.
That's a great point. I mean, Procter & Gamble has a lot of people trying to sell toothpaste in the U.S. Well, let me tell you, there's a lot more people trying to figure out how to sell toothpaste in China.
And the other thing is that they're saying that, you know, these mega corporations will not exist in 2050 like they are today. And that's why you keep seeing the downsizing. That they're saying that there'll be more micro companies, and that, you know, how you look at work today, which a lot of companies are looking at having flex. You don't work necessarily at an office. You can work from home virtually because technology enables you to do that. You could actually be a micro company that could work with, you know, workers that have people in the U.S., China, and India as a virtual company. So they're saying there's some restructuring going along around how companies are structured today, and it will be different then, and not all of these mega corporations. And you're seeing that happen naturally, but they're saying in the future, how you work might be different than what we're talking about work today, which is because technology is going to enable that.
Look, I make my living off the largesse of large corporations and the issues they have and the need for help. But I don't know that I would recommend to my children in the long term to go to a large corporation. I think encouraging young people to be entrepreneurs and start something, take risks. I think one of the issues you'll have is access to capital, right? Because if you went down to the South Orange Bank or whatever local bank here and asked them for $20,000 to start your business, they'd probably show you the back door as quickly as you came in the front door. And my point is, access to capital is going to be an issue for entrepreneurs, and that's just a bigger issue for anybody. And Frank, you've been in some startups. I'd like your comment on that in terms of, how does somebody start a business today?
Well, fortunately, the startups I've been in were founded by wealthy individuals.
There you go.
So I don't have to worry about that. But the point's a really good one, and that is, how does the government or other entities start to enable some of this entrepreneurship across these various cities? If I was to go back to the notion that cities is where I believe this will happen. How do local governments facilitate and enable entrepreneurship, whether it's through funding or through memberships? I know there's a number of states, New Jersey being one of them, that have VC organizations I think it's the New Jersey Technology Council that actually was established years ago, that was part of that startup, that actually funds companies to keep them in the state. So vehicles like that, I believe, start to enable some of this job growth through innovation. Because again, it's the small and mid-sized businesses that create 95+% of the jobs in this country.
I want to add a couple of just small comments. You're coming out into a world that is very different than the world we came out into. When I graduated, most of us graduated, there were some basic rules of the game that we kind of thought existed. And that is, you go to school, you get a 4-year degree, you go out and you get a job with a company. Based on the experience of our parents, you could somewhat project that you would be at a company maybe 20, 25 years, move up the ranks, maybe switch once or twice in order to get promoted, but you wouldn't be switching a great deal. That's not the world we live in. That's not the world we live in anymore. And I think what we're saying here in different ways is that even looking at our own careers, I'm looking at my career, you have to reinvent yourself based on where the demand is at a particular moment in time. Things move quicker. Companies grow, companies implode. So it's going to get faster. And some of that is a function of the global economy. Some of it is a function of the fact that we're in an interdependent global economy. So that, a crisis in Greece has an impact on the 401k portfolio of everybody in this room that has a portfolio with, that's exposed to those types of dollars. So you're going to have to be more creative, you're going to have to be more nimble, you're going to have to be more skilled than we were in some ways when we got out, because you're going to have to prove that you have, something that differentiates you. I think entrepreneurship is great, but entrepreneurship is really hard. I mean, 90% of the companies that are startups don't make it 2 years out. That's the reality of it. That's not supposed to scare you. That's supposed to motivate you to be part of that 10%, because you have to acquire the skills to be able to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. The people that we know that do it, like Benny Moneta and Argent, they've sacrificed a great deal, time, talent, and treasure to get to where they are. So it's not an easy thing to do. I think our politicians have an obligation, candidly, to make sure that the rules are a little bit fairer. I don't think it's fair that a government-funded company in China, can compete for work in the U.S., and not disclose that they're government-funded, and sometimes they don't. They use I think corporate espionage is a terrible thing, and a lot of that is coming out of that part of the world. I don't mean to pick on China, but they're the ones that are in the news right now. It used to be a couple of other countries. But I think we have to have some fair rules there. So my recommendation is be creative, differentiate yourself, and be ready for the future, because it's going to constantly change.
But don't be discouraged. I don't want anyone to leave this room being discouraged. No, seriously, because there are two things you can control that will impact your career, and that's luck and timing.
Yep.
Yes.
So we talked a lot about outsourcing and offshoring. I think that we lose a lot of unskilled or low-skilled labor in the U.S. to offshoring. But at the same time, I still think there's some creation of jobs that are maybe higher skilled, analytical, like supply chain management, which really wasn't a term that exists like 15 years ago, logistics and IT. Do you think that's a trend that's going to continue? And how do you think that U.S. companies can really capitalize on that trend of this kind of, I wouldn't want to say explosion, but this like very high amount of creation of jobs in higher skilled areas?
So I think that's the actual key. When we were, again, back to the time in Atlanta, when we were trying to create these regional clusters, if you will, the notion was that the low-wage jobs that we've lost really are not worth bringing back. What you really have to create is a higher-wage set of jobs that are built around the knowledge worker. And we talked about innovation and entrepreneurship, but really we're in a knowledge economy, at least in the U.S. we are, right? And so how do we exploit that? And again, I keep going back to this, create new industries, create new products and services that are more innovative, right? And the jobs that come with that are higher paying jobs. So you really move the wage scale up. We have two choices. We move the U.S. towards a higher wage structure, or we try to go back in time. And I, for one, don't think we should be going backwards.
I think we're completed the time, and just want to thank the panelists. I want to leave with data, an article that I found doing some research on the internet, which I believe really summarizes. It's really good. It's just a 3-page document that summarizes most of the also have been put here on this panel. And how to stay competitive in a global job market. So I want to leave this with you, so that you can share with everyone here.